I hope you're doing well. We're working our way through the book of Second Samuel, and we've seen chapters 1 through 5, and now we're gonna chapters 1 through 4. Now we're gonna jump into chapter 5. Chapter 5 is a critical chapter because it's the chapter where David gets crowned king, and so it sort of is a central point of the book, and it will be the point of the sort of the laying of the foundation of the reality of the Davidic covenant, which will come in chapter 7. And so this chapter is very important for lots of reasons. We're gonna look at it, but there's also some really interesting ties to Christ and what it is that He will do as the true shepherd of Israel and of his people. And so important chapter. We always want to encourage you to jump on the care group link on the website. I'll put it in the comments here in the video so that you can get on there. Download the commentary. It's helpful. There's a lot more information there. There's some questions you can walk through when you're studying this on your own, but hopefully it'll be an easy way for you to connect with some of what's going on in the text. So in chapter 5, we begin. David has now had everyone who could have gotten in the way of his being king been killed, not by him, but by other people, sort of through different types of even sinful ways that people have killed those who would have stood against him. And now Ishbosheth is dead, killed by his own men, and now we have David who's left alone. And so the people of Israel come to David and say, hey, can you please be king over us? We need a king. Saul is dead. Saul's line is dead. There's no one left who can be king over us. And so David, what they say actually in verse 2 is they say, the Lord said to you, now they're talking to David, they say, the Lord said to you, you will shepherd my people Israel, and you will be a ruler over Israel. And this connection between shepherd and king is very important. There's a lot more notes in the care group commentary, but what we see is that the idea of shepherding, of caring for a group, and then the idea of king, those two things are sort of connected together. And what happens in the book of Ezekiel, the prophet says, I will place my shepherd who will be king, whose name is David, over you. And we find out in Ezekiel chapter 37 that that's talking specifically about Christ. And so that's the connection that happens there. And so when Christ comes to the nation of Israel and he says, I am the good shepherd, it has more implication than just a person who cares for sheep. A shepherd was also a king. The kings were the shepherds of the people. In fact, in the book of Jeremiah, when God denounces the leaders of Israel, he denounces the shepherds of Israel. And he talks about the kings, the rulers, and also the priests as well, who should have been taking care of the sheep, but instead were just fleecing the sheep. And so that's sort of the connection that that God makes with this idea. And so you have David, who's going to be king, and he's going to be the shepherd of Israel to care for them. That points forward to the good shepherd who will come in the future. Now, all the elders get together. They agree that David needs to be king, and then they anoint David. And then what it says is that David made a covenant with them. There's always the greater makes the covenant with the lesser. And so in this case, David makes the covenant with Israel. Even though Israel had come to him and said, you're going to be our king, he's the one who makes the covenant with them. And so then you have this statement about David's reign. He reigns 7 years and 6 months in Hebron, and then he reigns 33 years, total 40 years over all Israel and Judah. And so you have this statement, a summary statement of his entire reign all the way until the end of his life. So, and then in verse 9 through, in verse 6 through 10, you have sort of an interesting summary statement as well. There's actually a number of things that take place from verse 6 all the way down to verse 16 that sort of summarize much of David's life. And the first place you see that is in the taking of Jerusalem. Now, really interesting stories here. The Jebusites are there. They're left behind of the conquest. They weren't, Joshua and his men were not able to conquer them. They're still in the city of Jerusalem. David says, let's go get the city of Jerusalem. He's going to take it. It becomes a pivotal city in the history of really the world. It's going to be the new Jerusalem. And so David's the guy who gets to take the city for the people of God, and he captures the stronghold of Zion, turns it into the city of David. They do it by climbing up a water shaft. Really interesting stuff in terms of historical, archaeological information. We found that the archaeologists have found that water shaft and that drops down into the spring of Gihon, which is just below the city of David. Really, really fun stuff. But that whole issue there is really just showing that God is with David, and he's becoming greater and greater. He's now establishing a city, which ultimately will be the city of the great king, the city of the Messiah. Jesus will come and reign in the new Jerusalem. And so there's all sorts of ways that God is blessing him and his rule. And then in verses 11 and 12, we find out that Hiram, the king of Tyre, is sending cedars to David so that he can build his own house and ultimately gather things together for the house of God. We're going to find out later later on in chapter 6. But this whole picture in chapter 5, verses 11 and 12, is actually taking place ultimately is taking place closer to the end of David's life. Hiram was alive at the beginning of Solomon's reign as well. And so Solomon, in fact, hasn't even been mentioned yet. He's going to be mentioned at the end of these verses, in verses 13 through 15. And so, what we have here is, again, another summary statement. They're sort of picking up a whole bunch of stuff. The author is a whole bunch of stuff from David's life and condensing it sort of into one idea, one sort of summary of David's reign. And so Hiram will show up later at the end of the book, and he's going to show up in Solomon's reign in 1 Kings. And so there's some statements there that are very helpful and interesting to see how those things are fleshed out. But it's not necessarily a strict chronological order here. And then we have statements about his wives and concubines, which he took from Jerusalem after he came from Hebron, and the sons and daughters that were born to him. Now, again, with every time that God blesses David, what you see in every single one of these instances is that David also has a problem. His problem is lust. He takes more wives, more concubines this time. Before, they were all just wives. And so even if you say, well, he wasn't supposed to multiply wives to himself, but it's ancient Near Eastern king, they do that. But here now, David is beginning to take concubines as well. He's really falling into lust, which we're going to find out is what we should expect, because what's his great flaw? His great flaw is Bathsheba. And so the author is showing us not only that David is being blessed by God and that David is walking righteously when it comes to political things, but the author is also showing us that David has this root sin issue of lust that he's not really dealing with. And so we have these names of his sons. Really interesting connections. Nathan and Solomon both appear in the line of Christ, one in the Gospel of Luke, one in the Gospel of Matthew. And so you have these very tight connections between David and Christ. Both of whom were born to Bathsheba, which is fascinating. Again, you have things that are summary statements of the book. We haven't even heard about Bathsheba yet, but his sons are named here. Now, what happens in verse 17 is that verses 6 through 16 is this kind of a summary statement of his whole reign, and then the author moves back again to the beginning of his reign and the war with the Philistines. And so David takes the city of Jerusalem, and then he essentially goes out and makes war with the Philistines. He comes down the valley of Rephaim. The Philistines have come up the valley of Rephaim, and David goes down and says, and he actually inquires of the Lord, shall I go and fight them? The Lord says, go, I'm going to give them into your hands. And so again, there's a picture of essentially God caring for David and using David as the means for caring for the nation. In fact, as they beat back the Philistines, they destroy them through really a miraculous set of events here in this battle. What God is doing is pushing the Philistines back away so that there can be peace in the nation of Israel. He's providing peace through David as a king. Why? Well, because David is obeying the law of Moses. He's, at least in the sense of letting God fight the battles for the nation, rather than being the one to go out and fight, which is the way that Saul handled things, at least later on in his reign. And so what you're seeing here is David being blessed by God. David is politically and morally a righteous person in one sense, but he has some flaws that are ultimately going to hurt him later on in the end. But that God uses David to provide a season of respite for the nation from essentially all the people around them who are making war against them, starting almost immediately with the Philistines. And David establishes the city of Jerusalem as the city of the great king, the city of David, stronghold of Zion, the place ultimately where Christ will rule forever as the ultimate fulfillment of the city as the son of David. So that's what's happening in this chapter. Very, very important chapter. And what's going to happen here now, this becomes sort of the launching pad into the movement of the ark and the reestablishment of the temple and the establishment of the tabernacle in the city of Jerusalem, and then finally the Davidic covenant when David says, I want to build you a house. And so all of that's going to trickle down in the next 2.5 chapters. We're going to see all those things take place. Before Bathsheba, before David's failures, we're seeing all of this stuff take place as God blesses the king. So there you go. There's lots here. The commentary is on the website, and again, the link is in the comments of the video, and so check that out. I look forward to seeing you all at Care Group, and if you're not able to come out because of coronavirus, no worries. Take some time, watch the video, check out the commentary, answer the questions. We hope you're blessed and encouraged by God's Word.